Sometimes the biggest risks in life lead to the most extraordinary discoveries. When a successful cattle rancher from Texas decided to purchase a remote mountain cabin in Colorado without ever setting foot on the property, he thought he was making a simple real estate investment. What he found when he arrived with the keys in his hand would change his life forever. Behind the rustic wooden door wasn't just furniture and empty rooms, but a mysterious woman who had been living there for months, completely unaware that her sanctuary had been sold. What started as a shocking confrontation between strangers would become one of the most unexpected love stories of the decade, proving that fate sometimes works in the most unusual ways. This is the true story of how two people from completely different worlds discovered that home isn't just a place you buy. Sometimes it's a person you never expected to find. Jake Morrison had built his life on calculated risks and hard work. At 42, he owned one of the most successful cattle ranches in Central Texas, spanning over 3,000 acres of prime grazing land. His days started before sunrise and ended long after sunset, managing hundreds of head of cattle, overseeing ranch hands, and dealing with the constant challenges that came with running a large agricultural operation. Success hadn't come easy, but Jake had a natural instinct for business and an unwavering work ethic that had transformed a modest inheritance into a thriving empire. The idea of buying a cabin in Colorado came to Jake during one of those particularly brutal Texas summers when the heat seemed to press down on everything like a heavy blanket. He had been working 18-hour days for months, and his foreman, an older man named Carlos who had been with the ranch for over 2 decades, finally told him what everyone else was thinking but afraid to say. "Boss, you're going to work yourself into an early grave," Carlos said one evening as they finished checking on a sick heifer. "When's the last time you took a real break? And I don't mean driving into town for supplies." Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, leaving a streak of dust across his skin. He couldn't remember the last time he had taken more than a day off, let alone a real vacation. The ranch was his life, his passion, but Carlos was right. The endless cycle of work was starting to wear on him in ways he hadn't wanted to admit. That night, instead of falling asleep immediately as he usually did, Jake found himself lying awake thinking about what Carlos had said. He stared at the ceiling fan slowly turning overhead, its gentle hum the only sound in the quiet ranch house. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to wake up somewhere else, somewhere cool and peaceful, without the immediate pressure of cattle to check and fences to mend. The next morning, Jake did something completely out of character. Instead of heading straight out to the pastures, he sat down at his computer with his morning coffee and started browsing real estate websites. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, but he knew he wanted something different, somewhere that would force him to step away from the daily grind of ranch life. Colorado mountain properties caught his attention immediately. The photos showed landscapes so different from his flat Texas terrain that they might as well have been from another planet. Snow-capped peaks, dense forests of pine and aspen, crystal-clear streams winding through rocky valleys. Jake had visited Colorado once as a teenager on a family trip, but that was over 25 years ago. The memory of that cool mountain air and the sense of endless space had stayed with him all these years. As he scrolled through listings, one property kept drawing him back. It was a cabin situated on 15 acres in the mountains about 2 hours west of Denver. The photos showed a rustic log structure with a wraparound porch surrounded by towering pines and with a view of distant peaks that took his breath away even through the computer screen. The listing described it as a perfect retreat for those seeking solitude and natural beauty, with details about a stone fireplace, hardwood floors, and what the realtor called authentic mountain charm. What really caught Jake's attention, though, was the price. The property was being sold as part of an estate sale, and the asking price was significantly lower than similar properties in the area. The listing mentioned that the previous owner had been an elderly man who had lived there year-round until his death 6 months earlier. His children, who lived on the East Coast, wanted to sell quickly and were motivated to negotiate. Jake stared at the listing for a long time, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Everything about this purchase went against his usual careful, methodical approach to business decisions. He had built his success on thorough research, personal inspections, and detailed financial analysis. The idea of buying a property he had never seen, in a state he barely knew, based solely on some photographs and a real estate description, should have seemed completely crazy. But something about those photos, about the promise of cool mountain air and peaceful mornings, spoke to a part of him that he had buried under years of responsibility and hard work. Jake found himself imagining sitting on that wraparound porch with his morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the distant peaks in shades of pink and gold, with no cattle to check and no ranch emergencies to handle. Before he could talk himself out of it, Jake picked up his phone and called the listing agent. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Patricia, was clearly surprised to hear from someone in Texas, but she was eager to help. She explained that the estate was indeed motivated to sell quickly and that the property had been on the market for 3 months without any serious offers. "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Morrison," Patricia said. "The cabin is pretty remote. It's about 30 minutes from the nearest small town, and the road up to the property can be challenging in winter. The previous owner, Mr. Henderson, was quite the hermit. He loved the isolation, but it's not for everyone." Jake found himself nodding as she spoke. Isolation sounded perfect to him. "What I need to do to make an offer?" he asked. Patricia walked him through the process, explaining that she could arrange for a virtual tour if he wanted, or connect him with a local inspector who could give him a detailed report on the property's condition. Jake listened to all her suggestions, but his mind was already made up. The logical part of his brain was screaming at him to slow down, to do his due diligence, to at least fly out and see the property in person before committing to anything. Instead, he heard himself saying, "I'd like to make an offer for the full asking price, cash, with a 30-day closing." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that Jake wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice careful and professional. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your interest, but I want to make sure you understand what you're getting into. This is a significant purchase, and you've never seen the property. Are you sure you don't want to at least arrange for an inspection?" Jake looked out his office window at the endless expanse of brown grass and blazing sun that stretched to the horizon. In the distance, he could see some of his cattle clustered around a water tank, seeking whatever shade they could find. It was barely 9 in the morning, and the temperature was already climbing toward what promised to be another scorching day. "I'm sure," he said. "Let's move forward with the offer." The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and wire transfers. Jake's lawyer in Texas worked with Patricia and the estate's attorney to navigate the legal requirements for the purchase. Jake's accountant advised him on the tax implications of owning property in Colorado. His insurance agent helped him secure coverage for a property he had never seen. Through it all, Jake maintained his normal routine on the ranch. He woke up early, worked hard, and fell into bed exhausted each night. But now there was something different in his daily routine. Each morning, he would check his email for updates on the Colorado property, and each evening he would study maps of the area around his soon-to-be cabin, learning the names of nearby peaks and towns, imagining the hiking trails and fishing spots he might explore. Carlos noticed the change in his boss almost immediately. "You seem different lately," he said one afternoon as they repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree branch. "Less wound up. What's going on?" Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at his longtime foreman and friend. Carlos had been with the ranch since Jake's father was alive, and he had watched Jake grow from a college kid with big dreams to a successful businessman who sometimes forgot to enjoy the fruits of his labor. "I bought a cabin in Colorado," Jake said simply. Carlos raised his eyebrows. "A cabin? When did you do that? And more importantly, when are you going to see it?" Jake grinned, feeling a bit sheepish about his impulsive decision. "I haven't seen it yet. I bought it sight unseen, based on some photos and a description. I know it sounds crazy." Carlos leaned against the fence post and studied his boss's face. After a moment, he smiled. "About time you did something crazy, Jake. Your daddy, God rest his soul, always said a man needs a little adventure in his life to keep him sharp. When do you take possession?" "Next week," Jake said. "I'm planning to drive up there, spend a few days, and see what I bought myself into." The closing went smoothly, handled entirely through email and electronic signatures. On a Thursday morning in late September, Jake received the final documents confirming that he was now the owner of 15 acres and a log cabin in the Colorado mountains. Patricia emailed him detailed directions to the property, along with the codes for the lockbox where he would find the keys. Jake spent that entire day in a strange state of excitement and nervousness. He had made plenty of big purchases in his life, but none quite like this. Usually, when he bought something significant, whether it was new ranch equipment or additional land, he knew exactly what he was getting. He had inspected it, researched it, and calculated its value down to the dollar. This time, he was flying completely blind, trusting nothing but instinct and some photograph that might not even be recent. That evening, Jake sat on his own porch with a beer, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and reds. His nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sound were the distant lowing of cattle and the rhythmic chirping of crickets. It was peaceful in its own way, but it was a peace born of familiarity and routine. The Colorado cabin represented something entirely different, something unknown and full of possibility. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Carlos, calling to check on him. "You nervous about tomorrow?" Carlos asked without preamble. Jake laughed. Terrified, he admitted, "What if I hate it? What if it's falling apart? What if I just wasted a huge amount of money on a whim?" "Then, you'll have learned something about yourself," Carlos replied pragmatically. "And you'll have a good story to tell." "When do you leave?" "First thing in the morning," Jake said. "I figure it's about an 8-hour drive. I should get there by late afternoon if I leave early enough." "You taking anyone with you?" Jake had considered inviting Carlos or one of his brothers to come along for moral support, but ultimately he had decided this was something he needed to do alone. "No, just me. I think I need to see it for myself first, figure out what I've gotten into." Carlos was quiet for a moment. "You know, Jake, I've been working this ranch for more than 20 years, and I've watched you pour everything you have into this place. You've built something amazing here, something your daddy would be proud of. But a man needs more than work, even work he loves. Maybe this cabin, whatever it turns out to be, is exactly what you need." After they hung up, Jake went inside and finished packing for his trip. He had decided to stay in Colorado for 4 days, giving himself time to explore the property and the surrounding area. He packed hiking boots, warm clothes for the mountain weather, and his camera, planning to take plenty of photos to show Carlos and his family when he returned. As he packed, Jake found himself wondering about the previous owner, the hermit named Henderson who had lived alone in the mountains for years. What had drawn him to such an isolated place? What had his daily life been like, surrounded by wilderness and solitude? Jake realized that in some ways he understood that impulse. Running a large ranch meant being around people constantly, managing employees, dealing with neighbors, negotiating with suppliers and buyers. The idea of complete solitude, even if only temporarily, had a strong appeal. Jake set his alarm for 5 in the morning, planning to be on the road by 6. As he lay in bed that night, he thought about Carlos's words about needing adventure to stay sharp. Maybe his old foreman was right. Maybe this impulsive purchase was exactly the kind of shake-up his life needed. He fell asleep thinking about mountain air and pine trees, having no idea that his adventure would begin the moment he turned that key in the cabin door, and that the solitude he was seeking would be the last thing he would find waiting for him in Colorado. Jake's alarm went off at exactly 5 in the morning, but he had been awake for the past hour, staring at the ceiling and running through mental checklists of everything he might have forgotten to pack. The excitement and nervousness had kept sleep at bay, and now that it was finally time to begin his journey, he felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that reminded him of Christmas morning as a child. He dressed quickly in comfortable jeans and a flannel shirt, grabbed his travel mug of coffee, and loaded his truck with the supplies he had packed the night before. His pickup truck was a reliable workhorse that had served him well on the ranch for years, and he was confident it could handle the mountain roads he would encounter in Colorado. As he pulled away from the ranch house, the sun was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. The drive through Texas seemed to stretch endlessly, mile after mile of flat landscape that Jake knew so well he could drive it with his eyes closed. He stopped for breakfast in Amarillo, filling up his truck and grabbing a hearty meal at a truck stop diner where the waitress called him honey, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. The normalcy of the Texas roadside culture felt comforting, but also highlighted just how far outside his comfort zone this whole adventure really was. As Jake crossed the border into Colorado, the landscape began to change dramatically. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance he could see the first hints of the Rocky Mountains rising like a wall against the western sky. The air grew noticeably cooler as he gained elevation, and he found himself rolling down the windows to breathe in the crisp, clean mountain air that was so different from the heavy, humid atmosphere of Texas. The GPS directions that Patricia had provided led him off the main highway and onto increasingly smaller roads as he approached his destination. First, he left the interstate for a state highway, then the state highway for a county road, and finally, the county road for what could charitably be called a gravel track that wound its way up into the mountains through dense stands of pine and aspen trees. Jake's truck handled the rough road admirably, but he could understand why Patricia had warned him about the isolation of the property. He hadn't seen another vehicle for the past 30 minutes, and the only signs of human habitation were occasional mailboxes marking the turnoffs to properties he couldn't see through the trees. The further he climbed into the mountains, the more he realized just how alone he would be at his new cabin. The final turn onto his property was marked only by a rusted mailbox with the number 47 painted on its side in faded black letters. The driveway, if it could be called that, was more of a dirt track that curved through the trees for about a quarter of a mile before opening up into a small clearing where the cabin sat like something out of fairy tale. Jake stopped his truck and just sat there for a moment, taking in his first real look at the property he had purchased sight unseen. The photographs hadn't lied, but they also hadn't fully captured the sense of scale and isolation of the place. The cabin was exactly as described, a solid log structure with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney, but it seemed almost to grow out of the landscape itself, as if it had always been part of the forest. The clearing around the cabin was maybe an acre in size, surrounded on all sides by towering pines that stretched up toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue and clear after the hazy Texas atmosphere Jake was used to. In the distance, through gaps in the trees, he could see the snow-capped peaks that had looked so appealing in the photographs. The silence was complete and profound, broken only by the gentle whisper of wind through the pine needles and the distant call of what sounded like a hawk circling overhead. Jake stepped out of his truck and stretched, feeling muscles that had been cramped from the long drive slowly relax. The air was thin and cool, carrying the clean scent of pine and something else he couldn't quite identify, but that seemed to speak of wild spaces and untouched nature. He grabbed his overnight bag from the back of the truck and walked toward the cabin, fishing in his pocket for the paper where he had written down the lockbox combination that Patricia had provided. The lockbox was attached to a post near the front steps, just as she had described. Jake worked the combination lock with fingers that were suddenly clumsy with excitement and nervousness. After a moment, the box clicked open, revealing a single key on a simple metal ring. He held it in his hand for a moment, marveling at how such a small thing represented such a big change in his life. Jake climbed the 3 wooden steps to the front porch, noting that the boards were solid and well-maintained despite the rustic appearance of the cabin. The front door was a heavy wooden affair with a simple brass handle and deadbolt lock. Jake slipped the key into the lock, turned it, and heard the satisfying click of the mechanism disengaging. He pushed the door open and stepped across the threshold into his new mountain retreat, expecting to find the empty, slightly musty atmosphere of a house that had been closed up for months. Instead, he was hit with the warm, inviting smell of something cooking, something that smelled suspiciously like fresh bread and coffee. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, his brain struggling to process what his senses were telling him. The cabin wasn't empty. The main room was clearly lived in, with a fire crackling cheerfully in the stone fireplace, books scattered on a coffee table made from what looked like a tree stump, and the definite sounds of someone moving around in what he assumed was the kitchen. Before he could decide what to do, a woman appeared from the kitchen area, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing an apron over jeans and a soft green sweater. She was probably in her early 30s, with long auburn hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of natural outdoorsy beauty that needed no makeup or fancy clothes to be striking. When she saw Jake standing in the doorway, she stopped dead in her tracks, the coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they just stared at each other. Jake tried to make sense of what he was seeing, while the woman's expression shifted from surprise to confusion to what looked like the beginning of fear. "Who are you?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the obvious shock of finding a strange man in what she clearly considered her home. Jake realized he was still standing in the doorway like a statue, and he forced himself to step fully into the cabin and close the door behind him. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "I just bought this place. The real estate agent gave me the key." The woman set her coffee mug down on the nearest table with a careful deliberateness that suggested she was fighting to maintain control over a situation that had suddenly become very confusing and potentially dangerous. "You bought this place?" she repeated slowly. "That's impossible. Mr. Henderson would never sell. This is his home." Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the thick folder of paperwork that documented his purchase. "Mr. Henderson died 6 months ago," he said gently, realizing that this woman might not know about the elderly hermit's death. "His children sold the property through an estate sale. I have all the documents right here." The color drained from the woman's face, and she sank down onto the couch as if her legs would no longer support her. "He's dead," she whispered. "How is that possible? I just saw him a few months ago." Jake felt a wave of sympathy for this stranger who was clearly devastated by news that should have reached her months ago. He moved slowly across the room and sat down in a chair across from her, being careful to maintain a respectful distance while still being close enough to offer comfort if needed. "I'm sorry," he said. "You obviously knew him well. Can I ask who you are? And how you came to be living here?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "I'm Emma Sullivan," she said. "I've been staying here since last spring. Mr. Henderson, he let me live here in exchange for helping him with things around the property. He was getting older, and he couldn't manage everything by himself anymore." Jake tried to piece together what had happened. His family never mentioned anyone living here when they put the property on the market. They told the realtor he lived alone. Emma wrapped her arms around herself as if she was suddenly cold despite the warmth from the fireplace. "His children never visited," she said bitterly. "They hadn't been here in years. They probably didn't even know I existed. Mr. Henderson and we had an arrangement, but it wasn't official. Nothing was ever put in writing." Jake felt the situation becoming more complicated by the minute. He had bought the property in good faith, with clear title and proper documentation, but it was obvious that Emma had been living here with the previous owner's permission and had no idea she was about to lose her home. "Can you tell me how this arrangement started?" Jake asked. "How did you end up here?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might provide answers to questions she had never thought she would need to ask. Finally, she began to speak, her voice soft but clear. "I was hiking the Continental Divide Trail last spring," she said. "It was supposed to be a solo journey to figure out what I wanted to do with my life after a pretty bad divorce. I had planned the whole route, resupplied at designated points, everything was organized. But I got caught in a late spring snowstorm about 10 miles from here. Really bad weather. The kind that can kill you if you're not prepared." Jake leaned forward, drawn into her story despite the awkwardness of the situation. "I managed to make it down to this area before the worst of the storm hit, but I was hypothermic and exhausted. I saw the smoke from the chimney and came to the door hoping for help. Mr. Henderson took me in, let me warm up by the fire, fed me hot soup, and insisted I stay until the storm passed." Emma smiled for the first time since Jake had walked through the door, and he was struck by how it transformed her entire face. "That was supposed to be one night," she continued. "But we got to talking, and I learned that he was living up here all alone, trying to manage 15 acres and a cabin that needed constant maintenance. He was in his 70s, and some of the work was getting too hard for him. I offered to stay a few extra days to help him with some projects that needed doing, and a few days turned into months." Jake guessed. "A few days turned into the most peaceful time of my life," Emma said simply. "Mr. Henderson was an amazing man. He had been a professor of literature before he retired up here, and he had this incredible library. We would spend evenings reading and discussing books, and during the days I would help him with repairs, gardening, cutting firewood, all the things that need doing to maintain a place like this." Jake looked around the cabin with new eyes, noting the obvious signs of loving care that had gone into maintaining it. The woodwork was polished, the floors were clean, and everything had the kind of order that came from someone who truly cared about their living space. "He never told you he was sick?" Jake asked. Emma shook her head. "He seemed fine when I saw him last. I had gone into town for supplies and to check my mail at the post office. That's where I've been getting mail sent since I've been staying here. When I got back 2 days later, I found a note saying he had to go visit his son in Denver for a few weeks, and that I should take care of the place while he was gone." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "That was 6 months ago." 5.5 months, Emma confirmed. "I kept expecting him to come back. I've been maintaining the property, keeping the cabin clean, splitting firewood for winter. I even planted a vegetable garden this summer, thinking he would be pleased to see fresh tomatoes and beans when he returned. The full scope of the tragedy was becoming clear to Jake. Emma had been living here alone for months, caring for a property and waiting for a man who would never return, completely unaware that he had died and that his home had been sold to a stranger. "I'm so sorry," Jake said, and he meant it. "This must be incredibly difficult for you." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and straightened her shoulders with visible effort. "It's not your fault," she said. "You bought the property legally, and you have every right to be here. I'm the one who doesn't belong." Jake looked at this woman who had been caring for his property for months without any compensation except shelter, who had been grieving a friend she hadn't even known was dead, and who was now facing the prospect of being homeless through no fault of her own. "Where will you go?" he asked. Emma shrugged, trying to project a confidence that Jake could see she didn't really feel. "I'll figure something out. I still have some money saved from before my divorce. I can get a hotel room in town while I make other arrangements." Jake thought about the long, winding road he had driven to reach this place, about the isolation and the distance to the nearest town. The idea of this woman packing up her belongings and driving away into an uncertain future while he moved into the home she had been caring for felt fundamentally wrong. "Wait," he said, surprising himself with the words even as they left his mouth. "Let's think about this for a minute. You've been taking care of this place for months. You know how everything works, what needs to be done, how to maintain it. I'm a cattle rancher from Texas who's never lived in the mountains before. I don't know anything about splitting firewood or maintaining a cabin in the wilderness." Emma looked at him with confusion. "What are you suggesting?" Jake wasn't entirely sure himself, but he found himself speaking anyway. "Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement, at least for a while, until you figure out what you want to do next. You could stay and help me learn how to manage this place, and I could compensate you for your time and knowledge." The offer hung in the air between them, and Jake wondered if he had completely lost his mind. He had driven to Colorado, seeking solitude and escape from responsibility, and now he was proposing to share his retreat with a complete stranger. But looking at Emma, seeing the care she had obviously put into maintaining the cabin, and the genuine grief in her eyes when she talked about Mr. Henderson, he knew he couldn't simply kick her out and take over the place she had been calling home. Emma studied his face for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if his offer was genuine or just polite sympathy. "You don't even know me," she said finally. "I could be crazy. I could be dangerous. For all you know, I murdered Mr. Henderson and buried him in the woods." Jake laughed, surprising both of them. "If you're a murderer, you're the most domesticated one I've ever met," he said, gesturing toward the obviously well-maintained cabin and the smell of fresh bread still coming from the kitchen. "Besides, you just spent the last 20 minutes convincing me that you had permission to be here. If you were up to something criminal, wouldn't you have just run when I walked in?" Emma actually smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes and made Jake realize just how beautiful she was when she wasn't devastated by shock and grief. "I suppose that's true," she said. "Though for the record, I'm not entirely sure you're not the dangerous one. You could be some kind of mountain psychopath who buys remote cabins to lure unsuspecting women into the wilderness." "If I am, I'm terrible at it," Jake replied. "I just offer to pay you to stay rather than trying to get rid of you." They looked at each other for a moment, and Jake realized that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between them. They were no longer a property owner and an unwanted occupant, but rather two people trying to figure out an unexpected situation that neither of them had any experience dealing with. "If we did work out some kind of arrangement," Emma said carefully, "what exactly would that look like?" "I mean, practically speaking." Jake looked around the cabin, trying to assess the living situation. From what he could see, there was the main room with the fireplace, the kitchen, and what appeared to be a hallway leading to other rooms. "How many bedrooms are there?" he asked. "3," Emma replied. "Mr. Henderson used the master bedroom, and I've been staying in the smaller bedroom at the back of the cabin. There's also a guest room that we mostly use for storage." Jake nodded. "So there's plenty of space for both of us, at least temporarily. And you said you know how to maintain this place." "I've learned a lot over the past few months," Emma said. "Splitting firewood, basic repairs, dealing with the solar power system, and the water pump, managing the propane for the stove and hot water heater. Mr. Henderson was a good teacher." Jake realized that he didn't know about any of those systems. The real estate listing had mentioned that the cabin was off-grid, but he hadn't really thought through what that meant in practical terms. What about food and supplies? He asked. There's a general store in Pine Ridge, about 30 minutes down the mountain, Emma explained. They have basic groceries and supplies. For anything more serious, you have to drive to Fairplay or even all the way to Denver. Jake was beginning to understand just how much he didn't know about living in such an isolated place. Emma had months of experience that would be invaluable, and the idea of trying to figure everything out on his own was starting to seem overwhelming. What do you think? He asked. Would you be willing to stay, at least for a while? I could pay you a fair wage for helping me get settled and learn how to manage this place. Emma was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the forest that surrounded the cabin. Finally, she turned back to Jake with an expression that was part relief, part uncertainty, and part something that might have been hope. I think, she said slowly, that might work. At least for now. Jake felt a wave of relief that surprised him with its intensity. Good, he said. That's good. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them processing the unexpected turn their day had taken. Jake had driven to Colorado, expecting to find an empty cabin and peaceful solitude. Instead, he had found a mystery, a tragedy, and a woman whose presence was already changing everything he had thought he wanted from this place. The smell of bread from the kitchen reminded Jake that Emma had been in the middle of cooking when he arrived. Is that bread I smell? He asked. Emma nodded. I bake my own bread. Mr. Henderson taught me how. The oven in this old stove takes some getting used to, but once you figure out its quirks, it makes amazing bread. Jake's stomach rumbled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since his truck stopped breakfast early that morning. Would you mind if I tried some? It smells incredible. Emma stood up, and for the first time since he had walked into the cabin, she seemed to relax slightly. Of course. I was just about to take it out of the oven anyway. And I made a big pot of vegetable soup for dinner. There's more than enough for two. As Emma disappeared into the kitchen, Jake sat back in his chair and tried to process everything that had happened in the past hour. He had come to Colorado, seeking an escape from complexity and responsibility, and instead he had walked into a situation that was more complicated than anything he had left behind in Texas. But as he listened to Emma moving around in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she worked, and as he looked around at the warm, welcoming cabin that she had been caring for with such obvious love, Jake realized that maybe complexity wasn't always a bad thing. Maybe some complications were worth embracing, especially when they came in the form of a beautiful woman who baked bread and knew how to split firewood and who was grieving the loss of a friend she had never had the chance to properly say goodbye to. The sun was setting outside the windows, casting long shadows through the pines and filling the cabin with a golden light that made everything seem touched with magic. Jake had driven to Colorado that morning as a successful but lonely rancher looking for a change of pace. As evening fell on his first day in the mountains, he was still looking for change, but he was beginning to suspect that the change he found might be very different from what he had been expecting. The first morning Jake woke up in his Colorado cabin, he experienced a moment of complete disorientation. Instead of the familiar sounds of cattle lowing and ranch hands starting their early morning routines, he heard only silence broken occasionally by the call of birds he couldn't identify and the whisper of wind through pine branches. The air was crisp and thin, carrying scents that were completely foreign to someone who had spent his entire life in the heavy, humid atmosphere of Texas. Jake lay in the guest bedroom for several minutes, staring at the wooden ceiling and trying to adjust to the reality of his situation. He was hundreds of miles from his ranch, in a cabin he had never seen before yesterday, sharing living space with a woman he had met less than 24 hours ago. By any reasonable standard, the whole situation should have felt like a mistake or at least a serious error in judgment. Instead, Jake found himself thinking about the evening he and Emma had spent together after she had fed him what was easily the best homemade bread and vegetable soup he had ever tasted. They had talked for hours, sitting by the fireplace as the sun set, and the mountain air grew cold outside the cabin's warm walls. Emma had told him more about her life before coming to the mountains, about her career as a freelance graphic designer that had allowed her the flexibility to work from anywhere, and about the divorce that had left her feeling like she needed to completely reimagine what she wanted from life. Jake had found himself opening up in ways that surprised him, telling Emma about the pressure of running a large ranch operation, about the loneliness that came with success and responsibility, and about the growing feeling that he had been living his life on autopilot for too many years. There had been something about the combination of the firelight, the mountain setting, and Emma's genuine interest in what he had to say that had made conversation easier and more natural than Jake had experienced in years. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted down the hallway from the kitchen, reminding Jake that he wasn't alone in the cabin. He dressed quickly in jeans and a flannel shirt, ran a hand through his hair, and made his way toward the source of the appealing breakfast aromas. Emma was standing at the stove, wearing the same jeans as the day before, but with a different sweater, this one a soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved around the kitchen with the confident efficiency of someone who was completely at home in the space. "Good morning," she said, looking up from the pan where she was scrambling eggs. "I hope you slept well. Mountain air can take some getting used to." "I slept better than I have in months," Jake admitted, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. "I think I forgot what real quiet sounds like." Emma smiled. "Wait until you experience your first mountain thunderstorm. The silence is amazing, but when nature decides to make noise up here, it really makes noise." Jake settled onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen counter, watching Emma finish preparing breakfast. She worked with the same careful attention to detail that he had noticed the night before, and he found himself wondering about the life she had built for herself in this isolated place. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. "How have you been supporting yourself while you've been living here? You mentioned that your arrangement with Mr. Henderson was just room and board." Emma turned off the burner under the eggs and divided them onto 2 plates. "I've been doing freelance design work online," she explained. "The internet connection up here isn't great, but it's adequate for my needs. I have clients back in Denver and a few other cities who send me projects. It's not a lot of money, but my expenses have been pretty minimal." She set a plate in front of Jake, and he was impressed again by the quality of the simple meal. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the bacon was crisp without being burned, and even the toast had been made from what was obviously homemade bread. "What kind of design work do you do?" Jake asked. "Mostly marketing materials for small businesses," Emma replied, sitting down across from him with her own plate. "Logos, brochures, website graphics, that sort of thing. It's not the most creative work in the world, but it pays the bills, and I can do it from anywhere with an internet connection." Jake nodded, impressed by Emma's adaptability and resourcefulness. "And you've been able to maintain your client base while living up here?" "Actually, my work has improved since I've been in the mountains," Emma said. "There's something about this environment that clears my head and helps me focus. Some of my best designs have come from sitting on the front porch with my laptop, looking out at the forest and the peaks." After breakfast, Emma offered to show Jake around the property and explain the various systems that kept the cabin functioning. Jake accepted eagerly, realizing that he had a lot to learn if he was going to successfully manage life in such an isolated location. Their first stop was the solar panel array that provided electricity for the cabin. The panels were mounted on a clearing about 50 yards from the main building, angled to catch the maximum amount of sunlight throughout the day. Emma explained how the system worked, how to monitor the battery levels, and what to do if the power went out during extended periods of cloudy weather. "Mr. Henderson was very proud of this system," Emma said, running her hand along one of the panels. "He installed it himself about 10 years ago. It's not the most modern setup available, but it's reliable and it provides more than enough power for the cabin's needs." Jake studied the array with the eye of someone who understood machinery and electrical systems from his ranch experience. "What happens in winter when there's less sunlight?" "The system is designed to handle seasonal variations," Emma explained. "And we have a backup propane generator for emergencies. Plus, when you're living off-grid, you naturally adjust your power usage to match what's available." Their next stop was the well and water pump system that provided fresh water to the cabin. Emma showed Jake how to check the pump, how to prime it if it lost suction, and where to find the shut-off valves in case of emergencies. "The water here is incredible," Emma said, cupping her hands under the spigot and taking a drink. "It comes from an underground spring, and it's probably purer than anything you can buy in bottles." Jake tried the water himself and was surprised by how cold and clean it tasted. "This is better than what we get from the wells on the ranch," he admitted. Emma led him to the woodshed next, a substantial structure that was stacked floor to ceiling with split logs. "Firewood is crucial for surviving winter up here," she explained. "The cabin has electric baseboard heaters, but they drain the solar batteries quickly. The fireplace and the wood-burning stove in the kitchen are much more efficient for heating." Jake looked at the impressive collection of split wood. "Did you do all this yourself?" Emma nodded. Mr. Henderson taught me how to use the chainsaw and the splitting maul. It took me a while to get the hang of it, but I actually found it kind of therapeutic. There's something satisfying about taking a big log and turning it into a neat pile of firewood. Jake picked up the splitting maul and hefted it experimentally. This is heavier than it looks. You'll get used to it, Emma said. We'll need to split more wood before winter really sets in. There are several dead trees on the property that need to come down anyway. As they walked around the property, Emma pointed out other features that Jake hadn't noticed during his initial arrival. There was a small workshop where Mr. Henderson had kept tools and equipment, a root cellar built into a hillside for storing vegetables and preserves, and a clearing where Emma had planted her vegetable garden. I wasn't sure what to do with all the vegetables, Emma said as they looked at the garden, which was still producing late-season tomatoes, squash, and beans despite the cool mountain temperatures. I've been canning and preserving as much as I can, but there's more than I can use by myself. Jake looked at the neat rows of healthy plants and the obvious care that had gone into maintaining the garden. You've done amazing work here, he said. I don't think I've ever seen a more productive vegetable garden. Emma blushed slightly at the compliment. Mr. Henderson said I had a natural talent for it. I never gardened before coming here, but there's something about working with the soil and watching things grow that I find incredibly rewarding. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the 15 acres that surrounded the cabin. Emma showed Jake the boundaries of the property, marked by old survey stakes and natural landmarks like distinctive rock formations and creek beds. She pointed out the hiking trails that connected to the larger trail system in the national forest and the spots where she had seen deer, elk, and even the occasional black bear. The wildlife here is incredible, Emma said as they paused at an overlook that provided a stunning view of the valley below, especially early in the morning and just before sunset. It's like having a front row seat to the greatest nature documentary ever made. Jake stood next to Emma on the rocky outcropping, taking in the view that stretched for miles in every direction. The valley below was a patchwork of forest and meadow, with a silver stream winding through it like a ribbon. In the distance, snow-capped peaks rose against the sky, so blue and clear it almost hurt to look at. I can see why you didn't want to leave, Jake said softly. Emma was quiet for a moment, her eyes focused on the distant mountains. This place saved me, she said finally. After my divorce, I was lost. I didn't know who I was or what I wanted from life. Everything I had thought I wanted turned out to be wrong, and I felt like I was starting over from scratch at 32 years old. Jake waited, sensing that Emma needed to tell her story at her own pace. When I started hiking the Continental Divide Trail, it was supposed to be about physical challenge and solitude, Emma continued. I thought if I could just walk far enough and climb high enough, I would figure out what came next. But finding this place, getting to know Mr. Henderson, learning to live simply and take care of myself, and this land, that's what actually helped me heal. Jake understood more than Emma probably realized. His own journey to this place had been motivated by similar feelings, even if the circumstances were different. What was your marriage like? He asked gently. Emma sighed. On paper, it looked perfect. David was a successful lawyer. We had a beautiful house in an expensive neighborhood. We went to the right parties and belonged to the right clubs. But underneath all that, we were just two people who had never really known each other pretending to have a life together. She picked up a small stone and tossed it over the edge of the overlook, watching it disappear into the forest below. David wanted a wife who would fit into his idea of success. Someone who would host dinner parties and look good at company events and never question whether he was actually happy. And I tried to be that person because I thought that's what I was supposed to want. What changed? Jake asked. I realized I was disappearing, Emma said simply. Every year, I became less myself and more what other people expected me to be. When David started talking about having children, I panicked because I knew I couldn't bring a child into that kind of fake life. Jake nodded, understanding the feeling of living up to other people's expectations rather than your own. Is that when you decided to leave? I told David I wanted to try couples therapy, maybe take some time to figure out what we both really wanted from our marriage, Emma said. His response was to tell me I was being dramatic and that if I wasn't happy, the problem was with me, not with our life together. Emma turned to face Jake, and he was struck by the strength and clarity in her expression. That's when I knew it was over. Not because we couldn't work things out, but because he couldn't even acknowledge that there was anything to work out. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the vast wilderness that had become Emma's refuge, and was now Jake's new home as well. "What about you?" Emma asked. "Have you ever been married?" Jake shook his head. "Came close once about 10 years ago. Her name was Sarah, and she was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, smart, came from a ranching family, so she understood the business. But when it came time to actually commit, I realized I was more in love with the idea of her than with who she actually was." "What happened?" "She wanted to get married and start a family right away," Jake said, "and I kept finding excuses to postpone the wedding. Eventually, she gave me an ultimatum, and I realized I couldn't make that commitment. She deserved someone who was sure about her, and that wasn't me." Emma studied Jake's profile as he gazed out at the mountains. "Do you regret it?" Jake considered the question seriously. "I regret hurting her," he said finally. "But I don't regret not marrying her. She found someone else within a year, someone who was crazy about her from day one. They have 3 kids now and seem genuinely happy. If I had married her just because it seemed like the right thing to do, we both would have been miserable." "It sounds like you both made the right choice, even if it was painful at the time," Emma said. "Maybe," Jake agreed, "but it made me gun-shy about relationships. After that, it was easier to focus on the ranch and tell myself I was too busy for romance." They made their way back to the cabin as the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky. Emma showed Jake how to check the solar battery levels and explained the routine maintenance tasks that needed to be done daily to keep all the systems running smoothly. "Living off-grid requires more active participation than most people are used to," Emma explained as they checked the water pump pressure gauge. "You have to pay attention to your power usage, monitor your water levels, keep track of your propane consumption. But after a while, it becomes second nature." Jake was impressed by how much Emma had learned in the months she had been living at the cabin. "Mr. Henderson was lucky to have you here," he said. Emma smiled sadly. "I think I was the lucky one. He gave me a place to heal and grow into the person I was supposed to be. I just wish I had been able to say goodbye properly." That evening, they sat on the front porch with glasses of wine that Emma had been saving for a special occasion. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and Emma had brought out a wool blanket that they shared as they watched the first stars appear in the clear mountain sky. "I've never seen so many stars," Jake said, craning his neck to take in the full expanse of the Milky Way that was visible above them. "Wait until you see the northern lights," Emma said. "Mr. Henderson said they're visible here sometimes during the winter. I haven't seen them yet, but he described them as the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed." Jake tried to imagine what it would be like to spend a winter in this isolated place, surrounded by snow and cold, and the kind of silence that only comes with deep wilderness. "Are you planning to stay through the winter?" he asked. Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "I hadn't really thought that far ahead. I was so focused on waiting for Mr. Henderson to come back that I never made plans for what would happen if he didn't." Jake understood that Emma was at another crossroads in her life, just as he was. The comfortable arrangement she had built for herself over the past few months was gone, and she had to decide what came next. "You're welcome to stay as long as you want," Jake said. "This arrangement is working better than I expected." Emma looked at him in the starlight. "Are you sure? You came here looking for solitude and space to think. Having a roommate probably wasn't part of your plan." Jake laughed. "Nothing about this trip has gone according to plan. But sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying to control every detail." Emma pulled the blanket more tightly around her shoulders. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. And I don't want you to feel like you can't ask me to leave if this situation stops working for you." "The same goes for you," Jake said. "If you decide you want to move on or this arrangement becomes uncomfortable, just say the word." Emma nodded. "Deal." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest and watching the stars roll slowly overhead. Jake found himself thinking about how different this evening was from what he had expected when he first decided to buy the cabin. He had imagined solitary evenings spent reading or planning improvements to his ranch, not sharing wine, and conversation with a beautiful woman who had turned his simple retreat into something much more complicated and interesting. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said suddenly. "Of course. Why did you really buy this place? I mean, you could afford a vacation anywhere in the world. Why a cabin you'd never seen in the middle of nowhere, Colorado?" Jake considered how to answer. "I think I was looking for something I couldn't name," he said finally. "My life back in Texas is good, but it's also predictable. I wake up every morning knowing exactly what the day will bring, and I go to bed every night knowing that tomorrow will be basically the same. I wanted to remember what it felt like to not know what was coming next. And how's that working out for you so far? Emma asked with a smile in her voice. Jake laughed. Better than I expected. Though I have to admit, finding you here was definitely not something I could have predicted. Life has a way of surprising us when we most need it, Emma said softly. As the night grew colder, they eventually went inside and banked the fire for the night. Jake lay in his bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night, and thinking about the conversation they had shared on the porch. Emma was right that life had a way of providing surprises when they were most needed. He had come to Colorado, seeking solitude and clarity, and instead he had found a mystery, a tragedy, and a woman whose presence was already changing his perspective on what he wanted from his time in the mountains. The last thing Jake thought before falling asleep was that maybe the best adventures were the ones you never planned for, and maybe the most important discoveries were the ones you made when you weren't looking for anything at all. 2 weeks into their unexpected cohabitation, Jake woke to the sound of something he had never heard before in his life. It started as a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by a sharp crack that made the entire cabin shake. Before he could fully process what was happening, Emma was knocking urgently on his bedroom door. "Jake, we need to get up," she called, her voice tight with concern. "There's a big storm moving in, and we have some preparation to do if we don't want to lose power." Jake stumbled out of bed and pulled on his clothes, looking out his bedroom window to see a wall of dark clouds rolling across the valley like a massive gray blanket. The wind had picked up dramatically, bending the tall pines around the cabin and sending fallen leaves swirling through the air in chaotic patterns. Emma was already in the kitchen, filling every available container with water from the tap. "Mountain storms can be intense," she explained as Jake joined her. "If we lose power, we lose the water pump, so we want to have plenty stored. And we need to make sure the solar panels are secure and bring in anything that might blow away." Jake had weathered plenty of storms on his Texas ranch, but those had been different. Thunderstorms that rolled across flat plains were dramatic but predictable. This felt like something else entirely, as if the mountains themselves were participating in the weather. Together, they spent the next hour securing the property. Jake learned how to adjust the solar panels to minimize wind resistance, while Emma gathered loose tools and equipment that might become projectiles in high winds. They brought in extra firewood from the woodshed and checked the propane connections to make sure they were secure. "The power might go out even if the solar system stays intact," Emma explained as they worked. "When the wind gets really strong, tree branches can fall on the lines that connect the panels to the cabin." As if to underscore her point, another gust of wind sent a large pine branch crashing down just 20 feet from where they were working. Jake looked up at the towering trees that surrounded the cabin, suddenly aware of how many potential hazards he had never noticed before. "Has this happened before while you've been living here?" he asked. Emma nodded grimly. "Twice. Once in late spring and once in midsummer. Mr. Henderson always said that mountain weather was like mountain wildlife, beautiful and impressive, but dangerous if you don't respect it." By the time they finished their preparations, the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall, and the wind was strong enough that they had to lean into it to walk from the woodshed back to the cabin. They made it inside, just as the storm truly unleashed itself on the mountain. Jake had thought he understood what a thunderstorm could be, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the raw power of a mountain tempest. The thunder didn't just roll across the sky like it did on the plains. It seemed to bounce off the peaks and valleys, creating echoes and reverberations that made it impossible to tell where one clap ended and another began. The lightning was so bright and frequent that the interior of the cabin strode between brilliant white light and darkness. The rain came down in torrents that Jake could hear drumming on the roof above the howling wind. Through the windows, he could see the pine trees bending at angles that seemed impossible, their tops whipping back and forth in the gusts. "Now I understand why you said mountain weather really makes noise," Jake said, raising his voice to be heard above the storm. Emma was monitoring the solar battery levels on a small display panel near the kitchen. "We're holding steady so far," she reported. "But if this keeps up for too long, we'll need to be conservative with power usage." They settled in the main room near the fireplace, where Emma had built up a substantial fire that provided both light and warmth. The combination of the flames dancing in the fireplace and the dramatic light show outside created an atmosphere that was both cozy and wild, intimate and epic. What do we do if the power goes out completely? Jake asked. We have oil lamps for light, the fireplace and wood stove for heat, and a camp stove that runs on small propane canisters for cooking, Emma explained. Mr. Henderson believed in being prepared for anything. He used to say that if you're going to live in the wilderness, you need to be able to survive like the wilderness is all you have. As if the storm had been listening to their conversation, the lights in the cabin suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the firelight and the intermittent flashes of lightning outside. Emma was on her feet immediately, moving with the confidence of someone who had dealt with this situation before. The battery display went dark too, she said, checking the solar panel monitor. Probably a tree branch on the line between the panels and the cabin. Jake felt a moment of anxiety as he realized how dependent he had become on modern conveniences without even thinking about it. The idea of being without electricity in such an isolated location felt genuinely dangerous, but Emma's calm competence was reassuring. She retrieved several oil lamps from a cupboard and began lighting them with matches from a waterproof container. Soon the cabin was filled with warm, flickering light that was actually more atmospheric than the electric bulbs had been. There's something kind of magical about this, Jake said, watching Emma move efficiently around the cabin, lighting lamps and checking supplies. Like we stepped back in time. Emma smiled as she lit the last lamp and placed it on the mantelpiece. Mr. Henderson used to say that losing power was sometimes a gift. It forced you to slow down and pay attention to things you normally missed. They spent the evening playing cards by lamplight while the storm raged outside. Emma taught Jake several games he had never heard of, and he taught her a few poker variations he had learned during long winter nights on the ranch. The combination of the intimate lighting, the dramatic weather, and the knowledge that they were completely isolated from the outside world created a sense of closeness that Jake found both surprising and appealing. I have to admit, Jake said as Emma dealt another hand of cards, this isn't how I imagined spending my time in Colorado, but I'm enjoying it more than I expected. Emma looked up from the cards, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the oil lamps. What did you think you would be doing? Jake considered the question. Honestly, I thought I'd spend my time hiking alone, maybe doing some fishing, reading books by the fire. Basically being a hermit for a few weeks. And instead you're stuck with a roommate during a power outage, playing cards and waiting for trees to stop falling on your cabin, Emma said with a laugh. When you put it like that, it sounds terrible, Jake said. But actually this is the most relaxed I've felt in years. Even with the storm and the power outage. Emma studied his face in the lamplight. Why do you think that is? Jake thought about it for a moment. I think it's because none of this is my responsibility, he said finally. Back at the ranch, if there's a storm, I'm responsible for making sure the cattle are safe, that the equipment is secure, that the ranch hands have what they need. Here, the storm is just weather. We deal with it, but we don't have to manage it. Emma nodded understandingly. That's one of the things I love about this place. Problems here are simple and immediate. Fix the generator, split more wood, repair the roof. It's work you can see and touch and complete. Not like the complicated emotional and professional problems that seemed to follow me around in my old life. They played cards until late into the evening, talking about their different experiences with responsibility and work and the challenges of modern life. The storm continued to rage outside, but gradually the thunder grew more distant and the wind began to die down. When they finally decided to go to bed, Emma showed Jake how to safely extinguish all but one of the oil lamps, which they left burning low in the main room for safety. They said good night in the hallway between their bedrooms, and Jake found himself hesitating, wanting to extend the evening somehow, but not sure how to do it appropriately. Thank you, he said finally, for teaching me how to handle all this. I would have been completely lost without you. Emma smiled. Thank you for not panicking when the power went out. You're a good partner in an emergency. Jake woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and the sound of Emma moving around in the kitchen. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind air that was crystalline clear and a landscape that sparkled with water droplets caught in spider webs and pine needles. Over breakfast, Emma explained that they would need to check for damage around the property and see what could be done about restoring power. The good news is that storms this intense usually don't last long, she said. The bad news is that they can leave quite a mess behind. Their inspection of the property revealed that they had been lucky. A large pine branch had indeed fallen across the power line from the solar array to the cabin, but it hadn't damaged the line itself. Several smaller branches were down around the property, but nothing that couldn't be cleared with some chainsaw work. Jake watched Emma inspect the down power line with professional competence, checking for damage and figuring out the best way to remove the branch safely. "You really have learned a lot living up here," he said admiringly. Emma shrugged. "Necessity is a good teacher. When you're living alone in an isolated place, you learn to fix things yourself or do without." They spent the morning clearing fallen branches and debris. Jake had brought work gloves and was comfortable with physical labor, but he was impressed by Emma's skill with the chainsaw and her efficiency in organizing the cleanup effort. "We should be able to restore power this afternoon," Emma said as they took a break for lunch. "But first we need to let everything dry out completely. Moisture and electricity don't mix well." In the afternoon, they successfully restored power to the cabin, and Jake felt a ridiculous sense of accomplishment when the lights came back on and the battery charging system resumed its normal operation. "I feel like we just survived some kind of initiation ritual," Jake said as they celebrated with cold beer from the refrigerator, which had kept everything perfectly cool despite the extended power outage. Emma laughed. "Welcome to mountain living. Every season brings its own challenges and its own rewards." The experience of weathering the storm together had changed something in their relationship. They moved around each other more comfortably now, with the easy familiarity of people who had worked together to solve problems. Jake found himself noticing small details about Emma that he had missed before. The way she hummed softly to herself when she was concentrating, her habit of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the graceful efficiency of her movements when she was working. The following week brought an entirely different kind of challenge. Jake woke one morning to find Emma sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, staring at the screen with an expression of frustration and worry. "Everything okay?" he asked, pouring himself coffee from the pot she had already prepared. Emma sighed. "I just got an email from one of my biggest clients. They're ending their contract with me. They said they're moving all their design work in-house to save money." Jake sat down across from her, noting the tension in her shoulders. "How big a hit is that to your income?" "About 40%, Emma said grimly. "I have a few other clients, but nothing that pays as well or provides as much steady work." Jake could see that Emma was trying not to panic, but he understood the fear that came with sudden financial uncertainty. "What are your options?" Emma closed her laptop and rubbed her temples. "I could try to find new clients, but that takes time and there's no guarantee. I could look for a traditional job, but that would mean moving back to a city where there are opportunities in my field." The implication hung in the air between them. If Emma had to find traditional employment, she would have to leave the mountain cabin and return to the kind of life she had been trying to escape. "What kind of work do you enjoy most?" Jake asked. "I mean, if money wasn't a factor, what would you choose to do?" Emma considered the question. "I love the creative side of design, but what I really enjoyed was working with Mr. Henderson on this place. Taking care of the property, maintaining the systems, working with my hands. I never thought I'd like that kind of work, but there's something satisfying about it that I never found in sitting at a computer all day." Jake had an idea, but he wasn't sure how Emma would react to it. What if you didn't have to choose between creative work and physical work? Emma looked at him questioningly. "I've been thinking about this place, about what I want to do with it long term," Jake said carefully. "I originally planned to use it as just a vacation retreat, but being here has made me realize I want something more. I'd like to develop it into a real working homestead, maybe raise some animals, expand the gardens, possibly even build some additional structures." Emma listened intently, not sure where Jake was heading with his thoughts. "The thing is, I don't know how to do any of that," Jake continued. "I know cattle ranching, but mountain homesteading is completely different. I need someone who understands this environment, who knows how to work with the land and the climate up here." Jake took a breath and made his proposal. "What if I hired you as a full-time property manager? You could handle the day-to-day maintenance and development of the homestead, and I could pay you a salary that would be competitive with what you were making from freelance work." Emma stared at him in surprise. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious," Jake said. "You know more about this place than I ever will, and you love it here. I need help developing it into something special. It seems like a natural partnership." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing the offer. "What would that mean in practical terms?" "I mean, for our living arrangement." Jake had been thinking about that as well. We could formalize the arrangement. You'd have your own space, your own independence, but we'd be working together on shared goals for the property. Emma looked out the window at the forest that surrounded the cabin, at the mountains that had become her refuge and her home. Can I think about it? Of course, Jake said. Take all the time you need. Emma spent the next 2 days hiking the property and thinking about Jake's offer. Jake gave her space to consider, but he found himself hoping she would accept. The idea of developing the mountain property into a working homestead was becoming more appealing every day, and he couldn't imagine trying to do it with anyone else. Emma's decision came on a crisp morning when they were sitting on the front porch with their coffee, watching a family of deer graze in the clearing near the cabin. I want to accept your offer, Emma said quietly, but I need you to understand that this isn't charity. If I'm going to be your property manager, I want to earn my salary. I want to contribute real value to whatever we're building here. Jake felt a rush of relief and excitement. I wouldn't have it any other way. Emma turned to face him, and I want us to be clear about the professional nature of this arrangement. I don't want either of us to feel awkward or uncertain about boundaries. Jake nodded, even though he was beginning to realize that his feelings about Emma were becoming more complicated than simple professional respect. Agreed. Emma extended her hand for a handshake. Partners. Jake shook her hand, noting how small it felt in his and how the simple contact sent an unexpected warmth up his arm. Partners. That evening, they sat by the fireplace and began planning their vision for the property. Emma had a notebook full of ideas she had developed during her months of caring for the place, and Jake contributed his business experience and his understanding of sustainable agriculture. I'd like to build a greenhouse for year-round vegetable production, Emma said, sketching rough plans on a piece of paper. And maybe add some chickens for eggs and meat. What about goats? Jake suggested. They're good for clearing brush, and they provide milk and cheese. Emma grinned. I love goats. Mr. Henderson always said this property would be perfect for a small herd. They talked late into the evening, their plans growing more elaborate and exciting as they fed off each other's enthusiasm. Jake found himself watching Emma's face as she described her vision for expanding the gardens and developing sustainable systems for the homestead. Her passion for the project was obvious, and her practical knowledge was exactly what he needed to turn his vague dreams into concrete plans. As the fire burned low and they prepared to go to their respective bedrooms, Jake realized that his simple retreat from ranch life had evolved into something much more complex and potentially rewarding. He was no longer just a cattle rancher taking a break from his routine. He was becoming a partner in building something new and meaningful with a woman who had already changed his understanding of what home could mean. The next few weeks passed quickly as they threw themselves into preparing for winter and planning for the future of their mountain homestead. Jake found himself staying longer than he had originally planned, calling his foreman, Carlos, more frequently to check on the ranch, and eventually admitting that he wasn't sure when he would be coming back to Texas. You sound different, boss, Carlos said during one of their phone conversations. Happier, maybe more relaxed. Jake was standing on the front porch while he talked, watching Emma work in the garden, harvesting the last of the fall vegetables before the first hard freeze. I am different, he admitted. This place, this life, it's exactly what I didn't know I was looking for. And the woman you mentioned? The one who was already living there. Jake smiled, remembering his early conversations with Carlos when he had been so uncertain about the situation with Emma. She's my business partner now. We're turning this place into a real, working homestead. Just business partners? Carlos asked with the perceptive tone of someone who had known Jake for 20 years. Jake watched Emma laugh as she chased a chipmunk away from her tomato plants, and he felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with business partnerships. It's complicated. The best things usually are, Carlos said wisely. After they hung up, Jake continued to watch Emma work, noting how comfortable and capable she looked in a mountain environment that had initially seemed so foreign to him. Over the past month, he had learned to split wood efficiently, to monitor the solar power system, to identify the signs of changing weather patterns, and to navigate the forest trails that crisscrossed their property. But more than that, he had learned to appreciate the rhythm of mountain life, the way each day brought its own small challenges and rewards. Emma looked up from her gardening and caught him watching her. What are you thinking about? She called. Just appreciating the view, Jake replied, and he meant it in more ways than one. Emma smiled and returned to her work, but Jake noticed the slight blush that colored her cheeks at his comment. Despite their agreement to keep their relationship professional, there was an undercurrent of attraction and affection that seemed to grow stronger every day they spent working together. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace planning the next day's projects, Emma brought up a topic that had been on both their minds, but neither had addressed directly. "Jake, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." Emma hesitated, as if she wasn't sure how to phrase her question. "Do you think you'll stay here permanently? Or is this just a temporary adventure before you go back to your real life in Texas?" Jake looked into the fire, considering how to answer. The question touched on concerns that had been growing in his own mind as he found himself increasingly reluctant to even think about returning to his old routine. "A month ago, I would have said this was just a temporary break," he said honestly. "But the more time I spend here, the more I realize that my life in Texas was missing something essential. Something I found here." Emma waited for him to continue. "The ranch will always be important to me," Jake said. "It's my family legacy and a business I've built from the ground up. But I've got good people running the day-to-day operations, and I'm starting to think maybe it's time for me to step back and let them handle more of the responsibility and focus on this place instead. Focus on this place and the life we're building here," Jake said, looking directly at Emma. "If that's something you want to." Emma met his gaze steadily. "It is what I want, more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." The honesty in her voice and the intensity of her expression made Jake's heart race. They were still talking about their business partnership and their shared vision for the homestead, but underneath those practical concerns was something deeper and more personal. "Emma," Jake said softly, "I need to tell you something." Emma tensed slightly, as if she was preparing for bad news. "This started as a business arrangement," Jake continued, "but my feelings about you have become more than professional. I don't want to make you uncomfortable or jeopardize what we're building here, but I also can't pretend that I don't care about you as more than just a partner." Emma was quiet for so long that Jake began to worry he had made a terrible mistake by being honest about his feelings. But when she finally spoke, her voice was warm and full of emotion. "I was hoping you would say that," she said softly, "because I've been feeling the same way, and I didn't know how to bring it up without risking everything we've built together." Jake felt a wave of relief and joy that was almost overwhelming. "So, where does that leave us?" Emma smiled, and in the firelight she looked more beautiful than ever. "I think it leaves us exactly where we're supposed to be. Together, in this place that brought us both what we needed, even if it wasn't what we thought we were looking for." Jake reached across the space between their chairs and took Emma's hand. She intertwined her fingers with his, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals while the mountain night settled around their cabin like a protective embrace. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the pine trees and the meadow with a thin layer of white that sparkled in the starlight. Jake realized that he was no longer thinking about this place as a temporary retreat or even as just a business investment. This was home, and Emma was the person he wanted to share it with, whatever challenges and adventures the future might bring. 6 months later, Jake woke on a crisp spring morning to the sound of Emma's laughter coming from outside the cabin. He looked out his bedroom window to see her in the newly fenced pasture, trying to convince a stubborn goat named Clementine to follow the rest of the small herd back toward the shelter they had built the previous fall. Jake smiled as he watched Emma negotiate with the recalcitrant goat, using a combination of gentle coaxing and strategic placement of grain to achieve her goal. The scene perfectly captured how much their mountain homestead had developed since that snowy night when they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. The past 6 months had brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. They had successfully weathered their first mountain winter together, learning to work as a team through blizzards, equipment failures, and the constant demands of caring for their growing collection of animals. The greenhouse Emma had designed was producing fresh vegetables year-round, and their expanded garden plots were ready for a spring planting that would provide most of their food for the coming year. Jake pulled on his boots and jacket and went outside to help with the morning chores that had become the foundation of their daily routine. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of wildflowers that would soon carpet the mountain meadows. "Clementines being particularly difficult this morning," Emma said as Jake approached the pasture. "I think she's jealous of the attention we've been giving to the new chickens." Jake laughed, remembering Emma's theory that their goats had distinct personalities and complex emotional lives. Or she's just being a goat. Emma grinned. That's your scientific explanation for everything. She's just being a goat. They're just being chickens. You have no appreciation for the deep psychological complexity of our livestock. I have appreciation for the fact that they provide us with milk, eggs, and endless entertainment, Jake replied, finally, coaxing Clementine toward the shelter with a handful of her favorite grain, which is more than I can say for most of my cattle back in Texas. The mention of his Texas ranch was casual now, without the uncertainty and conflict that had marked Jake's thoughts about his old life during their first months together. After much deliberation and long conversations with Emma, Jake had made the decision to sell the majority of his cattle operation and turn the day-to-day management of the remaining land over to Carlos, who had jumped at the chance to become a partner in the business he had helped build for 20 years. The decision had been both terrifying and liberating. Jake had spent his entire adult life building his ranch, and walking away from it felt like abandoning his identity. But the months in Colorado had shown him that his identity wasn't tied to any particular place or business. It was tied to the work he chose to do and the people he chose to do it with. Speaking of Texas, Emma said as they finished the morning chores and headed back toward the cabin, "Did Carlos call yesterday with an update on the spring calf counts?" Jake nodded. "Better than expected. And he wanted to know if we'd like him and his wife to visit this summer to see what we've built up here." Emma's face lit up. "I'd love to meet them. From everything you've told me, Carlos sounds like family to you." "He is family," Jake agreed. "And I think you'll like Maria. She's got the same practical approach to life that you do, and she's not impressed by anyone's nonsense." They had reached the front porch of the cabin, which Jake had extended the previous fall to create a larger outdoor living space. Emma had decorated it with plants and comfortable furniture, turning it into an outdoor room where they spent their evenings planning projects and watching the wildlife that had become accustomed to their presence. "I have some news," Emma said as they settled on the porch with their morning coffee. "I heard back from the publisher I contacted about the homesteading book." Jake looked at her expectantly. Emma had been working on a book about their experience developing a sustainable mountain homestead, combining practical advice with personal stories about their journey from strangers sharing a cabin to partners building a life together. "They're interested," Emma continued, barely able to contain her excitement. "They want to see a full proposal and sample chapters, but the editor I talked to thinks there's definitely a market for this kind of guide." Jake felt a surge of pride and excitement for Emma's success. Her writing had evolved far beyond the technical manuals and marketing materials she had produced as a freelance designer. The book project had become a way for her to combine her creative talents with her passion for the homesteading lifestyle they had built together. "That's incredible," Jake said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." Emma hugged him back, and Jake marveled at how natural and right it felt to celebrate her victories as if they were his own. "I couldn't have written it without everything we've learned together," she said. "This whole experience, from that first day when you walked through the door to building this place into what it is now, it's all part of the story." Jake thought about that first day, about his shock of finding Emma in what he had thought would be an empty cabin, and about how close they had both come to missing out on everything they had built together. "Can I tell you something?" Jake said. "I've been thinking about that day I arrived, and what would have happened if you had decided to leave instead of staying to help me learn about this place?" Emma settled more comfortably against his side. "What do you think would have happened?" "I think I would have lasted about a month before giving up and going back to Texas," Jake said honestly. "I might have learned how to keep the power on and the water running, but I never would have understood what this place could become. I never would have learned what I was actually looking for." Emma was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountain vista that had become the backdrop for their daily life. "I think I would have spent the rest of my life looking for this place again," she said. "After living here with Mr. Henderson, after finding peace and purpose in taking care of the land, I don't think I ever could have gone back to my old life." "So we saved each other," Jake said softly. "We found each other," Emma corrected. "Right when we both needed to find something we didn't even know we were looking for." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their goats graze in the pasture and listening to the chickens clucking contentedly in their coop. The morning sun was climbing higher, promising a warm day that would be perfect for the fence repairs they had planned and the tree planting project Emma had designed to create a windbreak for their expanded garden area. "Jake," Emma said suddenly, "there's something else I want to talk to you about." Something in her tone made Jake pay attention. What is it? Emma took a deep breath, as if she was gathering courage for what she wanted to say. I've been thinking about our arrangement, about the way we've structured our partnership, and our relationship. Jake felt a flicker of anxiety, wondering if Emma was having second thoughts about their life together. What kind of thinking? Emma turned to face him directly. We started as strangers who needed each other's help, then became business partners, then became something more. But we've never really defined what we are to each other, or what we want our future to look like. Jake realized that Emma was right. They had been living day by day, building their homestead and growing closer, but they had never had an explicit conversation about their long-term intentions or commitments. What would you like to define? Jake asked carefully. Emma smiled, and Jake saw something in her expression that looked like nervousness mixed with hope. I'd like to define us as permanent, as committed to building a life together, not just a business together. Jake felt his heart race with relief and joy. Emma, are you asking me to marry you? Emma laughed. I suppose I am, in my own indirect way. Unless you think it's too soon, or too complicated, or too much of a risk to our business partnership. Jake stood up and pulled Emma to her feet, spinning her around on the porch while she laughed with surprise and delight. It's definitely too soon, and too complicated, and too much of a risk, he said as he set her down. And I can't think of anything I want more. Emma threw her arms around his neck. Is that a yes? That's a yes to everything, Jake said, kissing her thoroughly. Yes to marriage. Yes to permanence. Yes to whatever complications come with building a life with someone you love. Emma kissed him back, and Jake could taste her smile. I love you too, she said against his lips. I have for months, but I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to say so given our business arrangement. Jake laughed. I think we can officially say that our business arrangement has evolved into something much more personal. They spent the rest of the morning talking about their future, about the wedding they wanted to plan for the following fall, about the expansion projects they could tackle as a committed team rather than temporary partners, and about the possibility of starting a family in the mountain home they had created together. I want to have the wedding here, Emma said. On the property, maybe in the meadow where we're planning to plant the apple trees. Jake loved the idea. We could invite Carlos and Maria and your sister from Denver and maybe some of the neighbors we've gotten to know. Small and simple, Emma agreed. Like everything else we've built here. That afternoon, they worked together on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by fallen trees during the winter. It was practical, unglamorous work, but Jake found himself thinking about how much he enjoyed the simple act of working alongside Emma towards shared goals. I have a confession, Jake said as they stretched new wire between fence posts. When I first bought this place, I thought I was looking for solitude. I thought I needed to get away from people and responsibilities. Emma looked up from a fence post she was bracing. And instead you found more responsibilities than ever, and a permanent roommate. Jake grinned. Instead I found that solitude wasn't what I needed. I needed to be responsible for something I actually cared about, with someone who shares my values and my vision for what life should be. Emma walked over to where Jake was working and kissed him softly. I love our life, she said simply. I love what we've built and what we're building. Even when Clementine is being difficult and the power goes out and we have to fix fences in the mud. Jake asked. Especially then, Emma said, because those are real problems with real solutions, and we solve them together. As the sun set that evening, Jake and Emma sat on their expanded porch with glasses of wine made from berries Emma had foraged and fermented using a recipe she had found in one of Mr. Henderson's books. They were celebrating their engagement and planning their immediate future, but they were also honoring the journey that had brought them to this moment. Do you think Mr. Henderson would approve of what we've done with his place? Emma asked, looking around at the homestead they had developed. Jake considered the question seriously. From everything you've told me about him, I think he'd be pleased that his land is being cared for by people who understand what he loved about it. Emma nodded. He always said this place had the power to heal people who needed healing and to bring together people who belonged together. I used to think that was just romantic nonsense, but now I understand what he meant. Jake raised his glass. To Mr. Henderson, for leaving us exactly what we needed to find each other. Emma clinked her glass against his. And to buying a cabin site unseen, which has to be the best impulsive decision anyone has ever made. Jake laughed. I still can't believe I did that. It goes against everything I thought I knew about myself. Maybe that's the point, Emma said. Maybe the best things in life happen when we stop trying to control everything and trust that sometimes the universe knows what we need better than we do. As they sat in the gathering darkness, watching the first stars appear in the clear mountain sky, Jake reflected on the truth of Emma's words. A year ago, he had been a successful but lonely rancher living a predictable life that had begun to feel like a prison. His decision to buy an unknown cabin in the Colorado mountains had been completely out of character, driven by impulses he hadn't fully understood. Now he was engaged to a woman he had never expected to meet, living a life he had never imagined wanting, in a place that had become more of a home than anywhere he had ever lived. The ranch in Texas had been his inheritance and his responsibility. This mountain homestead was his choice and his future. "Emma," Jake said as they prepared to go inside for the night. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to stay when I showed up at your door. For teaching me how to live in this place. For becoming my partner in everything. For making me understand the difference between the life you inherit and the life you choose." Emma kissed him goodnight, soft and sweet and full of promise. "Thank you for being brave enough to buy a place you'd never seen, and for being open to finding something completely different from what you thought you wanted." As Jake lay in bed that night, he listened to the familiar sounds of their mountain home. The wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the small settling noises of a cabin that had sheltered 3 generations of people seeking something better than what they had left behind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new projects as they continued building their homestead and their life together. There would be difficult days and hard work and probably some failures along with the successes. But tonight, Jake felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, with exactly the right person, doing exactly the work that matters most to you. He had driven to Colorado, seeking an escape from his old life. Instead, he had found the beginning of a life he was meant to live, with a woman who had been waiting in an empty cabin for someone who would understand that home isn't just a place you buy. Sometimes it's a life you build with the person you never expected to find.